Hello, I'm John Furrier with theCUBE. We are here at Seattle's headquarters for AWS for a halftime report on all the updates in 2025. It feels like the full year with the tons of announcements. You can almost run reInvent now, but it's still 6 months away, so it's kind of halfway, midpoint throughout the year. And we got a great guest, Joe Kunnackal, who's the director of Amazon QuickSight, a fast-growing product, something I can't wait to get my hands on. Joe, it's great to see you. Thanks for coming on. Halftime report, there's so much going on, packed in 1 year. I mean, I can't even keep track of all the announcements.
Oh yes, it's been great. I think we're seeing a lot of momentum, and the year's been exciting to say the least. We launched something called Scenarios, so one of our advances in generative BI. So that's been very interesting to a lot of customers. And we've also had a lot more going on. So
yeah, I talked to Matt Garman. I was telling him on his LinkedIn, another region gets launched. More data center CapEx investment for them to fuel the demand for more large-scale systems, more updates on the models. Swami's posting about all the greatness on Q. QuickSight seems to fit that narrative where you're starting to see, I won't say democratization, that's kind of been used, but like you're seeing non-DevOps people come into the cloud to move fast with their data. That's the theme, unlocking the value of data and workflows. And they want to get it at it fast.
Yes.
But there's two markets. There's the DevOps side, provisioning infrastructure. Now you have a whole nother usability feature.
100%. I think a lot of the emphasis has been on how do you get users to really find value from their data. And the DevOps side of it, making that as simple as possible definitely is something we want to do. But at the same time, with a product like QuickSight, what we've seen is over the years, there's been a lot of customer demand for scaling insights to everyone. So one of the reasons why we started out with QuickSight to start, a long time back was how this question from customers of how they scale insights to every user. So, data and insights are not just for the CEO or the managers, it's for every user. Because every user needs to know, hey, what's happening? Like, how many pieces of inventory do I have left? What do I need to do? Mm-hmm. And that became difficult with traditional products, especially in the BI space, because these were all built on some kind of server. And when you have, like 20,000, 50,000, Amazon's got, hundreds of thousands of people who are working on things, it becomes very challenging for you to scale that. Yeah. So QuickSight, and we brought in Q, and so the whole notion of Q was how do we make it simple for users to ask that question, get an answer. Yeah. And then I mentioned Scenarios where with Scenarios we're bringing in Agentic AI in order for users to ask that question and then continue that. So let Q and let the system kind of think about the problem, come back with a plan, and then work through it.
Lay out the structure of the portfolio, because sometimes it can be confusing. You got Q for developer, Q for business, you got QuickSight. How do I understand the map? How should people think about QuickSight? Is it all of that? Is QuickSight everything, or is it Q? Explain the hierarchy of the offering, the portfolio.
Yes, that's a great question. So we've had QuickSight for a number of years, which is our cloud-native BI product. It offers everything from dashboards to pixel-perfect reports to embedded analytics that you can add into your own products. In QuickSight, we launched Q back in 2021, which was a natural language interface. So that would allow you to ask questions of your data, so your database, tables and tabular data. And over the last few years, we introduced a larger portfolio of Q services, which is Q Developer, which is helping developers code faster and better, especially with generative AI coming in. And then you've got Q Business, which allows you to go against your unstructured data. So think your data in files, in SharePoint. So there's a lot of enterprise knowledge that's not in databases, not in data warehouses or data lakes. And these are just files and pieces of information that exist across the board. So whether it's in a third-party system like SharePoint or just files like sitting on your desktops. And it became very important and it became possible for generative AI to unlock this value. And so that's where we saw the potential of Q Business. So Q Business connects to a number of sources, and it supports the permissioning of data by user, so that you see the data that you're entitled to, which is very important because opening up all of the data to all of the people is simply confusing, but also a massive governance nightmare.
One of the things, just to kind of take a sidetrack on this, is that, go back 10 years, okay? 10 years ago, all the rage was you coming out of high school was, I want to get a CS degree, because people saw that having a computer science degree or coding was a superpower. Okay, great. And that's true. Now you're starting to see people saying, I don't really need to get a computer science degree, but I want to have a coder. How do I find a CTO or a coder? Now you have the era where it's available to code. So if you know the business logic, if you can actually have a coding assistant. So I think we're going to hit another wave of innovation where people who understand the business piece will have coding capabilities. That's why I love Q Developer, and that's the hottest area in Gen AI right now. So that's a phenomenon. So okay, so put that aside for a minute. We'll come back to that. The other thing is that the BI world of analytics, it's been around for a while, as you mentioned, that's colliding with generative AI. And there's an intersection of business analytics and business intelligence with generative AI. So how is Gen AI impacting analytics? That's the data. Data feeds the AI. AI is changing the face of business. Everyone's implementing it. And the people who now can code don't need to hire a coder or can learn a little bit and code more. So do more with more. Talk about that dynamics. I think this is the key point in the industry where the enablement is going to explode and create a huge aperture of value creators.
That's definitely a factor that's impacting the world of BI as well, because you will find that traditionally data was in a data warehouse. There is a BI person, a SQL person who's writing some queries and then translating that into something that you can see. Now there is a difference between a generative AI or an LLM writing SQL against some data to finding a business answer to a question. So, what were my sales in North America? When you ask that question, it actually needs to go through a number of business rules before it gets you the right answer. Otherwise, it's going to get you an answer because the LLM can go against that. So, what's happening in the world of BI is that agents and LLMs are actually helping make that process much faster. So, with Q and QuickSight as an example, what we find is that customers or business users are able to ask questions of data, whether it's in a dashboard or what we call a topic, which is essentially a link to a table. You're able to ask that question and get an answer instantly. And that was a process that would have taken maybe weeks because every BI team in this world is overloaded with questions.
Yeah.
And traditionally, what that would have also led to is building yet another dashboard. And what you don't want is that sprawl of dashboards, but you do want answers. So when we built Q and QuickSight, we did focus a lot on making sure that when you ask that question, we give you, traditionally, you get a single visual. So you ask me what are sales, it says, hey, sales are $5 million. Now, what you want is, okay, what were the sales? What is the trend? All of that. And you'll find that with Q and QuickSight, we've been able to put in a unique multi-visual response that provides that. But you ask about that part that you mentioned about anybody can be a coder. So that's where our recent launch of scenarios really comes in, where with scenarios, you have a data analyst by your side. And the reason I say that is you can ask a question like, what if we were to increase our free trial by 2 months? Like as a product person, let's say you had a product and you had a free trial. Now with scenarios, you'll find that it is able to go and build a plan around it. So it finds data that's in the system for you and says, hey, these are the pieces of information that might be relevant. Now let me go, this is what I'm planning to do. So it shows you a plan, and as a business person, you know the plan, but often you don't know how to run, let's say, a regression or do some forecasting. You're able to do that using scenarios. So scenarios will do the work for you. So in many ways, it is accelerating the work that you would have done. And at the same time, it is working in tandem with the business user and the business teams that are coding some of the logic.
On the business logic, I was having a conversation with a bunch of thinkers on a retreat this past weekend, young tech entrepreneurs and leaders, as well as old experience like us. The debate was, of course, I love the AI infrastructure, more GPUs, more XPUs, better models. But it came back down to the app layers where the business logic is. And that's where the gold is. Agentic is going to enable that. On our last interviews, we talked a lot about Agentic. How is Agentic feeding into it? Because you got scenarios, the business uses the target. How does a company leverage that? Because if I'm in a company, I might not give the access to the cloud to the business user. I'll give them to the DevOps team for sure. They're provisioning the resource on AWS. How do you connect that agent enablement into the business logic or the business side on QuickSight? Because I see QuickSight as an interface to the cloud. So take us through that. I'm a customer. I got the console, not everyone has root access, but you don't want to give out those credentials, but how do I enable QuickSight for my team? What's the best practice? Because this seems to be the better way than just sending a request into the DevOps team and saying, give me a report.
Definitely. So with QuickSight, you do have an interface that's completely off. You mentioned the console, the AWS console. So it is off the console. So it's like a regular SaaS application that you access. So you can get in there, you can ask the question. You can get in there and you start from the top. So you can get in there and provision access, and you do have the ability to connect your enterprise identity system. And then you can grant different levels of access to different users. So like you said, there are going to be a set of people who need to manage the data or set up the business rules. And then there are going to be a set of people who can ask questions. So as an example, if you look at Whole Foods, Whole Foods recently switched to QuickSight, and the thing is they do have store managers, like over 25,000 users across their stores, like these are supervisors in their stores who have access to QuickSight. So these folks need access to dashboards. They need to be able to quickly look at the data. And they get access at a certain level, so we call that a reader. And then you also have people who are building the dashboards and all of that. They get author level access. But the idea is that you have this easy to use interface that's off console, and you can go and ask those questions. Now, the moment you ask another question, which is how do you make this useful from a business standpoint? So that's where we see another service. We talked about Q Business earlier, which connects to your enterprise data. So at reInvent last year, we did bring in the notion of connecting Q Business and QuickSight. So now think of what can happen if you're able to ask a question of your data, but it takes not only the numbers into consideration, but also your notes from, let's say your notes that are in S3 or in SharePoint or in, Confluence, pick your product. So when you connect that data and then you ask a question like, let's pick the same question, what were sales in North America? And then you get a response that contains both the visuals, but also context saying that, sales in, let's pick a state, California, are going up because of a certain demand, and that's in your notes, and now that bubbles up into the question. So really the point is, how do you let a business user ask that question and read from both the unstructured data or the qualitative data, and then the quantitative or the structured data altogether. And by getting users into the QuickSight interface, you do that. And we've been building QuickSight for quite some time. So one of the core things has been building it cloud native. So again, going back to the scale point, every user needs to have the performance that makes them productive, right? And if you look at how, like I mentioned, Whole Foods, the previous tool that they used took about a minute because it was set up at a different time. Now dashboards take about 4 seconds. So store manager cutting down time by 60 seconds to 4 seconds is a massive difference, and you're saving a whole bunch of time that they can.
There's a huge productivity gain. It's clearly AI has checked the box on that. I think there's no debate in the industry. Certainly AI has got the productivity. I want to ask you about how people ask me, how do I get there? And you have two groups, the data team and the business users, right? The business teams and whatever. The question comes up is, I get AI, but I know I've got to do the workflows. I got to get the data. How do I get the data in? And a lot of people are preparing things on spreadsheets knowing it will be automated. So is there a readiness best practice for companies? Let's just say, pick a company out there that says, hey, you know what? My folks are using this cloud-based spreadsheet, or it could be anything, but we have all the data. It's manual, but it's good manual work. It's inbound logistics.
Yeah.
We love this process. It's well documented. We're happy to fill out these fields once. Data entry. Once it's in there, you now have part of the data.
Yeah.
That's the trend we're seeing. How is that translating with QuickSight, and how do you see agents coming in saying, okay, we'll take it from here? That seems to be what people want. They go, I'll do the work. Now what?
That's a great question. And AWS has a very large set of analytics services that provide you, all the way from the catalog to data processing to data transformation to QuickSight. And what we see is a trend where, exactly what you said, there are companies where people are doing this in Excel files. So let's pick a media and entertainment company. Very traditional. They've used spreadsheets because that's the way they work. But to get to that spreadsheet from their artist and data actually takes about a month. Now enter a product like QuickSight. What we've seen is that by transforming that spreadsheet into something that can be input into QuickSight, because QuickSight connects to S3, and by using some of the underlying services in AWS like Glue and others, you're creating a structured transformation from a spreadsheet-based system. The end user can still use a spreadsheet, but you're transforming that spreadsheet into a pipeline that now goes all the way into QuickSight. And in the case of that customer that I was just talking about, we went down from a month to like less than a week, because you still need checks and they have manual processes that need to be done. But that kind of transformation helps. And then you have the part where you can also on AWS, think about how the other infrastructure pieces fit in order to get you to that agentic future, because QuickSight's AI capabilities are also built on Bedrock. So by using that common foundation, you are able to build other services that are bespoke to your needs if needed, or use something that's in QuickSight. So you could just ask questions of scenarios or Q&A in QuickSight.
So you get all the benefits on top of that data. Just back up real quick. On the scope the time frame, you mentioned the time it takes. Is that setting up the pipeline? Was a manual process, now it's kind of automated or not?
In that case, it was automated, yes. I mean, it is automated now. So previously, what happens in many of these organizations, and we work with many of them because business teams typically have a mantra that if something's working, like they don't want to quickly go and change it because it helps continuity. So what we've been seeing is with QuickSight, we are seeing many instances where they were traditionally on spreadsheets, but it's quickly moving over. At the same time, we also have very large enterprises. So pick Capital One, JP Morgan spoke with us at reInvent last year. We do have a number of different companies that are working with us in order to transform their enterprise architecture, so rolling this out at scale. But at the same time, you also get adoption from business teams that are just finding this tool. To that question earlier, you don't need to go to the console. It's very easy to get in. So they're just going in it from a business productivity standpoint.
Talk about QuickSight from its origination. Obviously, a lot's changed. How would you describe QuickSight today for someone who says, really, I want to lean into this, I'm sold on the benefits, I'm willing to do the work? What is QuickSight today, and where has it come from?
That's a great question. Early on, when we started with QuickSight was probably the straggler among cloud native BI services. I mean, sorry, that's the wrong word. QuickSight is probably one of very few cloud native BI services. What you see now is that a lot of the other services are trying to approach a cloud native interface. So QuickSight, we've been building this foundation for about 10 years now. And on top of that, we have brought in dashboards, pixel perfect reports, embedded analytics, and all of the generative BI capabilities. So if you go into QuickSight, back in 2023, we introduced the notion of using Q in order to build your dashboards, in order to build calculations, in order to ask your questions as a business user, and also create stories. So a number of LLM-powered capabilities that came in via Q, which really benefit the business user. And what that translates to is the fact that this is a unique product that provides you all of these generative capabilities, but also it's very approachable. So you don't need to be an expert to start using QuickSight.
The developer piece always fascinates me. What are some of the trends you're seeing with customers? What's some of the adoption use cases? Can you share a story of someone getting in? What was their experience? What was their approach? And how does that relate to folks who want to use it now?
Yeah, definitely. So I think one of the stories that I can share is Itaú Bank in Brazil, which rolled onto QuickSight, I'd say roughly 24 months back. And they shared their story last reInvent, and they went from 0 to about 30,000 users in 9 months. And typically, something like that takes years. Like I think in the past, they've ramped up to that number in 7 years or so. So the fact is that you're able to ramp up into that product at an enterprise scale, with everybody starting to consume the product very, very quickly. And that requires a number of different dimensions, everything from the foundation of security and governance, making sure that when you're rolling something out in an enterprise, everybody needs to have access, but they also need to have secure access, right? Yeah. And at the same time, you also need to have the visualization capabilities. So at reInvent, we announced the integration with things like high charts, which make sure that you have a whole variety of visuals to go from. You have the Q&A capabilities and pieces that really make it approachable to business teams to get on board. And then you also have the features that you probably will not find in other BI products. So if you look at the integration with Q Business, the ability to go against your structured and unstructured data, that really does not exist. If you look at the scenarios capability, the Agentic AI, where you ask, it's not just a question and answer, but you say what you want in terms of an outcome, and you have a data analyst that is really, Q, working with you and walking you through what needs to be done, doing the regression, doing the forecasting. So I'd say that ramp up is fast, and we have a number of enterprises that we're working with in order to move that really, really.
What are some of the cool things you're working on now in terms of what's next with QuickSight? I can imagine building an app on top of it. Back in the old web days, you used to call them shortcuts, a link to a page. But you got dashboards. Okay, check, you got that. You got the queue for business. You got the developer side of it. Is there a future where I can just build apps on QuickSight today? And what's that look like in the future?
That's a great question, because I think where you're getting to is you spoke about the developer part of things, where things are moving really fast, and as much as you have a CS degree, right, you can build even without a CS degree, because you just need to know what you want to build. So one of the things that we are working harder and harder on is how do you get the unstructured data and structured data together, because that's really the foundation, the knowledge of your business. So there's a gold mine in every business team in terms of the knowledge that people have and knowledge that teams have. And then there's the question of what capabilities do you have. So today, in QuickSight, you've got the dashboard building capabilities, you've got the Q&A capabilities, and in Q Business, you do have a number of capabilities around asking questions of search and summarization. At reInvent, we added over 50 actions. So these are things you can do in third-party systems. So whether it is sending an email, sending a Slack message, connecting to Salesforce or Zendesk to update a ticket, there's a whole bunch of things there. And then we also worked on, we have Q Business, also had some automation capabilities that we've been adding. So there's something called Q Apps. Okay. So a variety of capabilities in there. So we are trying to see how do we best bring them together in a format that's more and more consumable for the business user.
It's almost funny, AI is so magical, because when people see how fast it can pipeline all these hard stuff that can go back a decade, they'll be like, okay, I got to do a schema on this, I got to do all this work. People almost have the philosophy now, and this is why I think data lakes are hot, and I think it's going to change because when they realize what that data is used for. But the mindset now is, I just give all my dump all my data into the cloud. I mean that in a positive way. Push it to the cloud, yep, and magic happens. Okay, so it's not that simple, yes, but take me through that. But the mindset is the mindset of actually releasing the data. It could be log files from a website traffic to database information, SQL files. So if I just pump everything into the cloud, that's the first step. That's kind of where people's heads are at. I'm oversimplifying it, but take me through the next step. Take me through the progression, because step one, get the data in the cloud, yeah, unstructured and structured. What happens next? What's the next progression for the customer? Do they? I mean, it all depends on what their use case is, but what's the general, there's a high level, yes, sequence of events?
There's a general saying that I think you'll find on LinkedIn and other places, which is that your AI is only as good as your data, mm-hmm, right? Because your data provides a lot of context, and if you provide too much unrelated context, you're just trying to muddle too many things, mm-hmm, together. So one of the fundamental things is when you have data in that form, like how do you make it clean, or how do you get it together in a format that makes sense for you as a user and also for any sort of agentic system. So I mentioned earlier how there are other AWS services. So we do, within QuickSight, you do have options to go and essentially tag the data, provide metadata. So in QuickSight, in Q, we provide the notion of something called topics. So with topics, you can add custom metadata. So if you are a mortgage broker, as a simple example, you might have terms that you use in the mortgage industry that people don't use outside. Being able to add that additional metadata is very important. So in Q Business, you have the same thing, where as you bring your data...
Like jargon.
Yeah, well, you can call it jargon, but people use that on a day-to-day.
Words that mean something, yes, in context.
In context,
yeah,
yes. So because when a business user asks a question, they are going to have that jargon or the specific words that they use. That's not going to change, right? So you can't ask them to say, use pure words in order to get responses.
Yeah. The joke in cybersecurity was no terrorist writes bomb on the manifest. But you have to infer that. But there's a lot of context and inference going on. So the cleaning is a big problem, opportunity to fix.
It's an opportunity, and we do have services in AWS. So there's the SageMaker unified catalog. There's the catalog. There's other services like Glue. So those allow a business team to go and specify the rules and clean that. And then in QuickSight, as an example, you do have the option to go and put in that metadata in there. Join the data as needed. So that's all the data team in some ways. And many of these teams also have the notion of a producer and a consumer. So there are central data teams that do this and business teams that consume it. But once you have it in the system, then you're able to start asking questions of it.
You know, Joe, I want to get this, I'm kind of come full circle because I said earlier, the business intelligence, the analytics market, which has been around for a while, there's best practices, there's use cases, cultural, you know, job descriptions and people do things. The generative AI is where the breakthroughs are coming in. The intersection of both those. You got breakthroughs happening, which is step function change, needle moving moments. What's the innovation equation that you're seeing right now where you can have the best of, I understand why I have analytics, but I have new disruptive enablement for breakthroughs, for better things.
Yes.
What's going on in that intersection of those two markets?
I'd say that you'll see a mix of sentiment there in that market because you do have places where generative AI can directly play a part. So I'll give you a simple example. We talked about scenarios. One of the teams inside Amazon use scenarios against their ticketing data. And ticketing data can be messy because they have a number of tickets that are, feedbacks. Actually, to be clear, this was, I think, feedbacks. So they had a lot of feedback, and they're looking at the date, the bunch of things, but they also have raw text in there. So traditionally, a database system would find it difficult, but something like scenarios, which is Agentic, now is able to parse that. It is able to correlate tickets or feedback suggestions with what components did that come from, what devices did it come from, but it's also able to mine the unstructured feedback. So the text that you have in there, it's able to mine that in order to make sure that you are getting the output of both the structured and unstructured data using an agentic system. So you're seeing differences there where these systems can get to it, but at the same time, not all data can be accessible that way. Yeah. So some of the work will come in just making sure you have all the data piping together in order to form that unified lake as you were talking about.
I think if you can build a feature called the data cleaner, just press a button, just clean the data. That seems to be the heavy lifting. I got to ask you from a top selling or hottest feature, what's the best adopted or use case feature product component of QuickSight that's got the most traction right now for folks who are leaning into it, while preserving the future innovation headroom that's out there? What would you say the main thing is?
I'd say that in the BI world today, and with QuickSight specifically, you're seeing a lot of interest in what we call the generative BI capabilities, and that includes like queue and scenarios. And the reason for that is that in an industry where you traditionally had to go and click and build a dashboard, or that's for the analyst, or for the business user, have to either ask a question, send an email to get a response. On both sides, AI is making a difference, right? For the analysts, it is helping them build those dashboards faster. Calculations, as an example, were a huge thing. Like you try, even in Excel, if you try to write a calculation, it takes you a while to get it right. So having AI kind of help you with it, having Q help you with it, that's a big deal. And for the business user, having the ability on the Q side. So I look at it as a collection of features because it's not that you use the Q&A but not the dashboard building. But those capabilities are generally super exciting.
Okay, I'll rephrase. Outcome. What's the number one outcome they want? Just ease of use.
Faster insights to data, right? That's the number one, because traditionally many of these things have taken very long. Yeah. So nobody likes to wait 2 weeks for a response.
And to your other point, no one wants 10 more dashboards.
Nobody wants 10 more dashboards.
So you have dashboards of dashboards, so I think Gen AI could abstract away that.
Yeah, definitely.
One hot trend I want to just bounce off you and get your thoughts is that we're seeing the words preemptive, predictive. You're starting to see, even in security, preemptive -0 days, they're calling it, where they can see attacks while they're forming.
Yeah.
The pattern that's going to be a ransomware attack, be prepared. Alerting the security teams, like, here it's coming. In business, I could see preemptive, predictive, data, generative helping. Hey, you might have a down quarter. Like, that's where kind of the dream of agents comes in, where the data is actually getting smarter. It's almost reasoning moves to intelligence. What's your thoughts on that?
I'd say that is definitely an area which has a lot of potential. And traditionally, we've used different names to talk about some of these things. So even within this product in QuickSight, you do have the notion of what we call anomaly detection. So it can look against, for example, your sales data, your customer data, and you connect it, and it can keep track of, are there any interesting patterns. So exactly the same thing that you talked about in terms of security. And on the Q business side of the house, we have seen that there are things like actions, where you can take an action. So as we are bringing these different capabilities together, there definitely is the question of, can I see some of these things and can I take decisions? So the whole in the BI market, they call it decision intelligence. So can I make decisions based on the intelligence? And then in some ways you do want the human to actually make that decision, because you don't want the system to automatically keep kind of chopping around. So that's where, again, connecting it back to scenarios in Q, what we've seen is that there is a lot of potential for agents to play that. But there's also the question of, you don't want these systems to just operate. So scenarios is unique in that it allows you to inspect the plan and then work with the plan. So connecting all of that, lots of potential in that area.
I just wrote a blog post leading up to the two events that happened this month, Snowflake and Databricks, the big data conversations going on there related to this. I kind of introduced the idea of the agent systems intelligence layer, what around is called the green layer, the green field, or it's a layer of innovation. But this move to intelligence is going to enable the user to take more authority or have agency. You're starting to see the empowerment side of it. Any thoughts on or reaction to or commentary on the impact to the user? Because remember, whoever can see the value disrupting point to innovate, if they don't have agency or authority, they can't implement it. They know about it. So you're starting to see on the business side, huge power shift to those people who have the domain expertise, who know how to manage the data, leverage the tools and the tooling.
I think in that space, bringing together, again, we are on this journey to bring together structured and unstructured data. And as we are bringing that together, we definitely see that more context is helping the user take better decisions. So I'd say that, yes, all of that context will help, but it is something that we'll continue to think about and invest in.
All right, well, I really appreciate you coming on, and I have to ask, okay, we're at the midpoint. Look back between reInvent and now, what happened, and then what's the focus going into reInvent for you?
Well, I think reInvent and now we've been innovating quite a bit on the Q business front, on the QuickSight front, on the Agentic front. Heading up to reInvent, it's like you said, it's a fast-moving world where I think everything's changing. The LLMs are getting more powerful. Developer tools are getting more powerful. So my hope is that we'll have a lot more exciting things for you in the next 6 months.
Well, I'm looking forward to playing with QuickSight and getting those dashboards out to all of our people. Appreciate it, Joe. Thanks for coming on.
Of course, thank you.
Okay, we are here at AWS headquarters for our halftime report. 2 days of coverage, filming and broadcasting. I'm John Furrier, host of theCUBE. Thanks for watching.